Hey guys, Sam here at NA Studios. Today I want to take a look at vocal EQ. I want to discuss all the areas of the EQ spectrum and how you can make them work for a vocal. How each of these areas is going to affect your vocal, whether you're boosting, whether you're cutting, whatever it is. And we've all seen these EQ sheets that kind of go around on the net, but it's important to be able to hear what's actually happening when you're boosting and cutting these areas. Just seeing it written down is not a massive amount of use. So let's put it into practice. Let's see exactly what these areas are doing, and we'll hear what's going on my voice. Let's check it out. So you can see I've got Neutron 4 here on my vocal channel, and this is great because it allows you to create a load of different bands and we can see exactly what's going on. So by the end of this video, we're not only going to know what we can do with these different bands, how we can EQ a vocal, we're going to know why it sounds the way it does, but crucially, how we can EQ a vocal to work in a certain scenario. If you've got a track where the guitars are just masking the vocals, well, what can you do to make that vocal pop out? Or if you've got a vocal that sounds like it's clashing with the snare drum too much, or any of the other instruments, we can discuss which areas of the frequency spectrum are going to be the ones that you need to go to. So let's start off with the low end. So here we've got 100 hertz, and this is really the kind of fullness. You can hear as I boost this up, we're getting a really full kind of sound. You'll recognize that as a sort of a radio sound, you know, that almost cinematic movie trailer kind of this summer coming to whatever it is. You can recognize that because it's got so much impact to it. As I bring that back down to 0, it gets a bit more leveled out. But if I bring that down, you'll notice how my voice is just thinning out so much and it's losing all of that kind of low end impact, and it's losing a lot of the warmth as well. So as I bring that back up to 0, you're hearing a far more natural sound. So the voice, at least the male voice, is going to have some content down in that 100 to 200 hertz region. So it's important to take notice of that. And is there too much? Is there not enough? If the voice sounds a little bit thin, then perhaps you need to increase that area around the 100 to 200 hertz area. If it sounds too full, if it sounds too boomy, then you need to cut that out. It's also worth mentioning here that I've just started at 100 hertz. I've not started any lower because anything below that is kind of useless in our voice. You'll notice that I've got a high pass here at 80 hertz, and that's for the very good reason, because nothing below that, especially in my voice, is really of much use. We can just cut that out completely because that's just going to be noise of things touching the microphone, of general nastiness in the room. We don't really have much use for that in a vocal, so we're just going to get rid of it completely. Next up, we've got the area sitting around 300 hertz. Now, whenever I'm mentioning these frequencies, this is not just to say that the only frequency this occurs at is 300 hertz, and this won't occur at 305 hertz. It's this general region. So the area I'm about to speak about is in the region of 300, but it's also down to maybe 250 and perhaps up to 500. And this is the area that can become really boxy if we have too much of it. So we're going to have this kind of issue if we're in small rooms where we're recording, where we've got early reflections. Just take a listen as I increase this, and you'll start to recognize that kind of boxiness. Even if I bring that out a little bit more, that horrible, oh God, it's terrible, that kind of cardboard boxy sound. If I bring that back down to a normal rate, we know that sound as sounding cheap. We know it as sounding not good to our ears. So if we've got too much of that in there, then 300 hertz, that general region, is where we want to cut that out. It's that woofy, empty, cardboard box sounding kind of area. As a rule of thumb, I'm typically never going to be boosting in that area. That's not to say you should never ever boost. You should use your ears and work out if you need to boost. But generally 9 times out of 10, if I'm affecting that area of the EQ spectrum, I'm going to be cutting it. So you can hear now as I cut that region, things just get a little bit more scooped. We lose that kind of cardboard boxiness. If I take that band off completely, that honkiness just kind of comes back. And then as I bring it back in, we just lose that a little bit. So I think of that as the kind of cheapness area. So if you've got a vocal that just sounds a little bit cheap, a little bit unprofessional, a little bit cardboard boxy, it just has that kind of quality to it, then you can try that 3, 4, perhaps up to 500 hertz area. Try notching some of that out and see if that helps. It's important to say though, when we're discussing these areas, we're talking about 300 to 200 to 500. That's quite a broad range. So if we bring up, say, band number 2, let's bring this area up. We can see that we're increasing at 150 hertz, but we're also increasing down here at around 100 and sometime up to 300 as well. So it's not just one specific frequency that we're adding to. But that can be useful if there is just one specific frequency that we want to boost or cut out. If I make this really narrow, so we're only really affecting one frequency, and I'm just going to, you can already hear that kind of ringing. If I just sing a note, ooh, and then match, you can hear that ringing, ooh. If I really bring that up, you can hear that note. It's 154 hertz, and we can also see here, it's a D sharp. Ooh, you can hear that ringing. So if I bring that back down again, if we've got that kind of resonance, that one note that just overrides the whole vocal, which often happens in small rooms, what we can do is we can narrow this band so we've just got a small range of frequencies and we can bring that down. So now if I sing that same D sharp, ooh, you can hear as I bring the band back on again, the kind of fundamental of that note actually comes back into play. So if we've got just one note that's being a problem, whether it be in the low end, the mid-range or the high end, we can use that technique, just a really narrow band, zone in on that frequency, and then we can notch it out. And it's going to get rid of some of the room resonances that you might have if you're recording in a small room. So moving on to this 600 hertz region then, this is kind of an extension of that 300 hertz region. And to me, it bridges the gap between that low mid area and the actual mid range. So we're not going to get as much of that low boxiness, but we're not going to get the bite of the mid range. This one sits somewhere in between the two. Let's just take a listen to what this actually does as I bring it up. So you're going to notice it gets kind of cheap sounding again. If I broaden that out just a touch, you'll notice that it's got that honky kind of boxiness, but not in the same way as the 300 did. So this is the 600 boost. And then let's do that boost at 300. It's got that familiar kind of cardboard box sound to it. But if we go back to the 600, you'll notice that it's a little bit higher. It's just sitting a little bit above that 300 hertz. So the effect that it actually has on the voice is similar to that 300 hertz. It's that kind of strangled sound where it sounds really mid-rangey and almost like you've lost all the bottom and all the top on a speaker. It sounds really, really nasty and nasal in that mid-range. So if you've got too much of that nasal quality there, then the 600, 700, sometimes 500 hertz region is a good area that you can use to duck some of that out. And again, this is not one that I'm particularly often going to be boosting. I'll often just be cutting this kind of area, but it's a very handy area to know that if you're missing some of that area as well, you can boost it, but 9 times out of 10, I'm going to be cutting this area. Let's take a listen. If I were to cut this area, you just hear how the vocal, it kind of thins out a little bit, but it just gets a little bit more scooped. We've got the lows there still. We've still got the highs, the sibilants. If I take this band off though, you can hear that mid-rangeness that when I bring it back on again, just kind of disappears. That cardboard boxy kind of sound is a bit of a weird way of describing it, but to me, that describes it best. So you've got that weird sound kind of in the middle. It's not mid-range, it's not low end, but it's that nasty cheapness. And you can use this area really effectively, dip it out if you've got those kind of room resonances, if you've got that inside your head kind of voice, you can use this area to get rid of that. So moving up into the mid-range now then, this is focusing on the 1 kilohertz area. And just hear what this does to the voice. If I just speak completely normally and I bring this up, you can kind of just hear the voice gets a bit louder. If I broaden this out, then it does it even more so, but it's still got that kind of element of the cardboard boxiness of the 600 hertz, because as I'm going really broad, it's actually boosting there as well. So a little bit goes a long way in this 1 kilohertz area. If I bring it up slightly, then we're actually just getting a little bit more of the intelligibility of the vocal. If I bring it down, then it just sounds kind of hollow, and you stop really being able to hear as much of the vocal. If I narrow that down again, so we've got a bit more of a natural kind of slope here. If I bring it up, then we just get that mid-range, that it's not quite honkiness, it's above that honkiness. It's the nasal quality, and it's that cutting frequency that you can hear. And it just reminds me of listening to something on a very, very small set of speakers where, again, you've got no lows, you've got no highs. It's just that mid-range. but this is a really powerful area in the EQ spectrum. As I said, a little bit can go a long way. If you just find that your vocal isn't quite cutting through enough, it's just not quite got every word that can be heard, then this is a really important region for that. If we just bring this up, just say a couple of dB, and then take a listen to it with and then without, you can hear that that subtle difference can just make it so that it cuts through a little bit more. And this area is going to be really handy if you're fighting against a rhythm guitar or a synth or something like that. This is probably going to be the area that you're going to need to take a look at, because this can make it so you can hear the words properly. This will make it so that you've actually got some intelligibility there, so you can hear it coming through against that, maybe a wall of sound where you've got loads of guitars or you've got loads of synthesizers or keyboards, whatever it is. This is a really important range, and the mid-range is so important for the vocal because that's where a lot of it lies. So just an extension of that mid-range then is coming up into this 3 kilohertz region. This is such an important region in all of mixing, not just vocal mixing, because our ears hear this region, the 3 to 3.5 kilohertz area, more than any other frequency. We are much more susceptible to those frequencies. Our ears are much more finely tuned to those frequencies. So a small boost in that area can be far more noticeable than a small boost in another area. So around this 3 kilohertz area, if I just bring this up just slightly, even at like 2 dB, 3 dB, we're noticing a real lift there. If I then take that off again, then the vocal just kind of settles down a little bit. If we bring it back on again, it's kind of cutting through. If I bring this up even more, this might get a little bit painful because that kind of 3.5 kilohertz area, that gets really brash and really aggressive really quite easily. So that area is your cut frequency. That 3 to 4 kilohertz, that's the area where stuff can get really, really harsh. So if we're looking at boosts versus cuts, if we need to hear the vocal a little bit more, if it just needs to lift above everything, just a small amount, but we don't want to do that with the volume, we don't want to do that with a fader, then we can do that with EQ. Somewhere around that 3 to 4 kilohertz region is a great area to EQ, just to bring up maybe 2 dB, just to bring your vocal above everything else. So that's really going to help you, again, in that region where you've got guitars, snare drums, synths, keys, anything of that kind of mid-rangey sound. That 3 to 4 kilohertz region is so, so important. Bringing that up is going to allow you to have that cut to come through, but bringing it down is just going to effectively turn down the voice a touch. If I then bring that EQ off again, you can hear how my voice apparently became a little bit louder, but then as I bring it back on again, it just kind of calms down. It just means that it's not quite as obtrusive to our ear. As I said, that 3 to 4 kilohertz region, our ears are so sensitive to that area that any small moves can make a big difference. So if we need our vocal to just come above the mix just a little bit, just in that mid-range intelligibility area, then that 3 to 4K region is super important. However, if your vocal is sounding a bit harsh, a bit cutting, if it's kind of resonating a little bit in that mid-range and you've got that aggressive side to it, then this is probably going to be the area that you need to address, that 3 to 4K region. You just want to turn down the shrillness of the vocal, just the aggression of the vocal, whether it's sung, rapped, voiceover, whatever it is. This is going to be the region that you want to take a look at to remove that aggressive nature of what's going on. Now the 5 kilohertz region, this is again an extension of that 3 to 4K region, but this starts to come into presence and this gets towards the high end. It's not high end yet, but it's more about the intelligibility of the vocal and really hearing the diction in the words. So if I bring this area up, the 5K kind of region, already you can hear how it's just got a bit of a sheen to it. It's just got a little bit more kind of breathiness to it, and it's just really affecting the overall, the consonants in my voice. You can hear the C's and the S's and the T's and the D's. You can hear those a lot better. So if I bring that back down, it just settles off a little bit. It just makes it a little bit more gentle. We're not applying any EQ boosts or cuts there. This is just the natural sound. Then as I bring up that 5K region, it's just getting a little bit more aggressive, for the want of a better word. It's just getting a little bit more shrill, but it's not too much in the mid-range, not too much in the high end. It just sits in that area in between. That 5K region is very important for the presence of a vocal. Often if your vocal is fighting against a lead line, whether it be a guitar or a synth, a keyboard, whatever it is, then this is a really important area. You can try ducking this area in the lead line and bringing it up in the vocal, and that will just create some separation between the two. As I bring this area down though, you'll notice that my voice just kind of gets a little bit duller. We still have that bottom end, but in relative terms, we've kind of turned that bottom end up because we've turned that 5K region down. We still get all the S's, the tss, we've still got all those, but it's just that mid-range, the k, k, and the t, t, all that area. If I turn that off, so we hear the k, k, t, t, with it cut, k, k, t, t, that's with it back on again. Such a difference there in the consonant sounds, and that's the diction of the voice. That is really where you start to hear the words and you start to hear the syllables of the words. So if you're having trouble hearing exactly the words that are being sung in a vocal, then that's the area that you can start to take a look at. That 5-6 kilohertz region, that's where the real intelligibility, the real phrasing and the diction of the words really comes into play. But again, as with the 3 to 4K region, if you're getting a bit too much in the kind of shrill area, this is a good range to take a look at reducing slightly. It's just going to turn down the vocal in kind of real terms. It's just going to make it so you don't have that shrill, high mid frequency kind of area to it. So to our ear, that's going to sound like the vocal has been turned down. But really, we're just adjusting and tilting the EQ of the vocal. So if you've got too much diction in there, you feel like you're getting too many consonants, too many C's, too many T's and D's, that's going to be a good area to address and to start bringing that range down. Now this 8 kilohertz region, this is a really interesting one because it's not quite got the shrillness of the mid-range, but it's also not quite got the airiness of the top end. So if we take a listen to this 8K area, if I boost this up slightly, then what we're going to hear is the overall breathiness of the voice is going to come up slightly. We can hear that. It's got a little bit more top end to it. If we take it out, then it's almost as if we've put a sheet over the vocal. It's just become far more present and far less forward. If I take this band off while I'm talking, then it's almost as if the high end all just comes back and you can kind of hear me again. It's as if I've got closer to you. As I bring that on again though, remember this is a cut. As I bring this cut back on, I've almost just moved a little bit further away. So if I bring this back up to 0, it's just at the natural place. So what do we say about that? Well, that 8K region is so important, again, for the diction and for the consonants and for actually just understanding what the vocalist is saying. If you can't hear those C's, T's, D's, B's, the consonants in the voice, then you're just left with a load of garbage that you can't really hear. This is super important. So again, if you're having trouble against guitars or potentially in this area, it's starting to come into cymbals and high-end instruments. So if you've got synth pads, that's going to be something that's going to have a lot of content in this kind of 8K region. And remember, this is going to be a broad boost as well. So we're never really going to be doing very narrow boosts in this area. We are, however, going to be doing narrow cuts. If we have something that is just really essy and we have something that a de-esser would kind of cope with, then this is the region that a de-esser is really going to be acting upon. It will be compressing in that area as opposed to EQing. But before we get to that point, if we just had an area that was really sibilant and had something in that 9, 8, 7K region, then we could just duck it down just a touch with some EQ. And that would just help to calm it down. So as I bring this 8 kilohertz region up, we get a far more in-your-face kind of vocal. It's just got a bit of a sheen to it. It's far more than that mid-range, but it's not quite as much as the airiness of the top end we're going to see in a moment. And if we bring it down, then it just means that the vocalist kind of gets a little bit further away from us, and it just gets a little bit boxy, and it gets a little bit less in the way of diction. You can imagine that if that with the vocal cutout was in the middle of a mix, then it would get lost quite easily. So this is an area that if you're losing your vocal in your mix, then this is going to be quite a good area combined with the 3K that you can boost. And remember, you can combine some of these together. So if we have, say, this middle region, the 5K, it's in between the 3K and the 8K. So if we boost this one on its own and then broaden it right out, well, in that case, we're actually dealing with the 3K area and the 8K area as well by making it so broad. So that's really increased the diction of the voice. If I then bring it down, it goes back to normal. If I bring this down even further, however, we lose so much of the voice. We don't want to be doing these really broad kind of cuts because they just take away from the voice so much. In general, a good rule of thumb is broad boosts and narrow cuts. That's not to say you have to use that all the time. just a lot of the time that is kind of going to be how it works. So broad boosts, you're boosting a broad range of frequencies. If you're cutting, as we saw in the low end when we had that one note that was sung, then we can be cutting out those one single notes. And that's going to be the resonances and the small problems that can mask an otherwise good vocal. And then the top end here, this is really the icing on the cake. You'll notice that I've got an analog high shelf here. Typically with the other ones, we were going for a bell filter. So as I increase, you'll notice that it comes up and then it goes down again. But I'm not doing that with a high end because a shelf is often quite a lot better for a vocal. So you'll see as I lift up the shelf, it comes up, but then it doesn't actually come down again. And this is important because it's a different filter type, and it means that all of the frequencies above the one that you select are going to be boosted. And you can hear that it's got this sibilance to it, it's got this airiness to it, and this high register to it. If I bring this down, then it's almost as if someone is just moving me backwards, and it's as if someone's throwing a sheet over the vocal. It's quite an unnatural sound. But this is a very important range in the vintage versus modern kind of thing. So if you want more of a vintage sound, then taking away some of this high end is automatically going to give you that old school kind of vibe that it's as if someone's singing through like a ribbon microphone or something that's a bit less up front and forward. As I bring up this high end though, you can hear how just the S's, it's a massive, massive difference. And you can really hear how this is creating such a different sound in this area. So high end is really useful if you need to get over the top of a mix, if you need it just to shine through everything else. We all know that super bright kind of vocal that we're used to hearing in modern music. Well, the high end is how we're going to achieve this. But equally, if we've got too much in that high end, if it sounds a little bit thin, then taking away some of that high end is going to be a useful tool to have and create that slightly more vintage feel than the real modern upfront bright vocal sound. I hope that's been useful for you, and I hope you can now take a look at vocal EQ with a bit more information, with a bit more of an informed ear, and take a listen to it and be able to identify where, well, there's this certain issue. I've got too much of a kind of a nasally boxiness. Well, I know that the 300, 400, 500 hertz is where I need to look. If I need to just bring up the intelligibility of the vocal, then I know that mid-range is something that I need to address. Hope you've enjoyed watching. I'll see you again soon. Take care.